you've got absolutely nothing to lose in life by smart investments of time and curiosity.
That was this week's guest on Conscious Conversations, Glenn Manton. This is a really, really beautiful conversation. I think Glenn's deeply authentic and hugely curious, and we sort of get into his psyche a little bit and how he thinks and how he grew up and what stimulated him and where he struggled, growing up, and how he's used that to show up with real authenticity. And he speaks deeply about a turning moment when he was 15 that he decided that he'd never be inauthentic again, which was hugely powerful. So that's sort of where this podcast goes. It goes down many directions, but all of them are really authentic. We talk about his sporting career a little bit. We talk about his new book, Put Your Damn Phone Down, and I highly recommend anyone wanting to read something a little bit different and to be sort of challenged on how we think and how we look at life to grab this book. I also see it as a real benefit with teams and workshops to provide some different type of thinking to stimulate our thinking. So that's the book, Put Your Damn Phone Down. This conversation isn't just about the book. It's about Glenn and how Glenn shows up. It talks about modern technology, parenting, rituals and ceremonies. We sort of cover a whole genre of different conversations that I'm deeply passionate about, but also realise that Glenn's deeply passionate as well. There's some great chemistry, I think, in the podcast. He brings real thoughtfulness and challenges me on some of my questions, which I was really grateful for. So if you want to check out more of Glenn, it's glennmanton.com.au, I think, or just Glenn Manton on Instagram. Myself, if you want to get a little bit more of me, and you can get me at lukemclean.net or Luke McLean Mindfulness, and there's some meditations, some blogs, and also my other podcasts. But without further ado, sit down, grab yourself a coffee or a tea and maybe a notepad and listen to this unique conversation with Glenn Manton and Conscious Conversations. Glenn, just as a kid growing up, I would love to get into describing what that was like for you. What were the learning moments that potentially when you got older that you actually really realised how important they were as a kid, in your neighbourhood, and what were you learning back then?
It's an interesting question because it's so broad and there are so many ways in which I could dig into the question, and without falling into an instant rabbit hole, I would suggest that my childhood ultimately was fairly lonely.
Yeah, okay.
In the sense that I could probably never be satisfied with anyone else's attention. I didn't seek attention, so to speak, but I coveted time with other people, and ultimately through work commitments, through life commitments, there weren't enough people around me to satisfy my inclinations to talk, or to play in inverted commas, or just to explore the world. So I'm not being critical of anyone, nor myself. It's just circumstance that I was one of those kids / still am one of those people who just love stimulus.
Okay.
And ultimately in 1973 when I was born through 1988 when I was 15, there just probably wasn't enough stimulus for me to be satisfied.
So how did that play out? How did that unsatisfaction play out? Like, how did it show up, or how did it internally?
I think upon reflection, I can appreciate how lonely I was and how desperate for conversation I was, and learning and general interaction. At the time, it would manifest, I think, in frustration and anger and outbursts of stupidity, which I think you can put against any young person. I don't know that I was terribly unique in that regard, but I came from a very loving home, a very stable home. My parents are still together in 2018 as we record this podcast, so that's not the norm.
Yeah, for sure.
In a world in which the divorce rate is 45% and climbing, my parents are still together for better or worse. So for me, it was an environment in which there was a lot of generosity, but just not enough exploration.
Yep.
I'm the sort of person who wants to look over every fence and peer through every hole and stick my finger in, and sometimes it gets bitten, other times you touch gold. But that's my personality as a child, and the one standout from that space, that childhood space, which for me amplifies what I'm sharing, is grade 2, where I would have been 6 years old, because I went to school when I was 4.
Okay.
So I was 6 years old in grade 2. Mrs. Timbury wrote on my report card that Glenn has a very vivid and wild imagination. And
Wow.
that is something that has always stuck with me. And if I really unpacked, not that we have time right here on this podcast, but if I had time to really unpack that want, that inquisitive need, that desire to fuel my mind and fuel personal exploration, I'm sure I could find countless examples from my childhood to now, where I'm constantly grazing, feeding, wanting to digest everything around me.
Did you use that, call it curiosity and inquisitiveness, for instance, and that want to continue to evolve and question and poke the fingers in? Did you use it as a strength as a kid, like to continually grow yourself, or was it more destructive?
You use the word destructive, I would use the word disruptive.
Okay, cool.
I would have found it was disruptive to how I perceived myself,
Yep.
how others perceived me, how I perceived the world around me. We're recording this particular podcast from inner city Melbourne, suburb Yarraville, a place called Kindred Studios, which is an eclectic mix of nooks and crannies and artist space, performing spaces, and everything here feels very comfortable to me.
Yeah, cool, okay,
It doesn't faze me, it doesn't worry me, it doesn't concern me. Over your left shoulder is an interesting piece of artwork of a goat sitting in a bar ordering, or seemingly to order, a drink with a guitar by his side. That's the sort of stuff as a kid, and even now, that resonates with me. Not to say that I'm not equally impressed with a sheer concrete polished wall. That looks fantastic as well. But as a kid, I think you're particularly concerned that you do have an attraction to the goat, so to speak. You are saying, oh God, no one else in this space seems to be at all interested in the goat, but the goat interests me. So does that make me a weirdo? Does that make me strange, different? Does that make me an outcast? And certainly all of those feelings are feelings that I felt as a young person, which I would suggest that you felt along the course of your journey in life, and that most people listening to this podcast have felt over the course of their life. But for me, it was probably more extreme, because I had knowledge from a young age that there were extremes in life, and I could handle them.
Yeah, okay. And were you happy to sit outside the circle, like, of the norm at school, and even, within the sporting groups that you probably played in? Were you happy to sit outside?
It's a very interesting question in the sense of the use of the word happy. Was I happy to do so? At times, possibly yes. At other times, no. Did I even really appreciate that I was sitting outside the circle, that bubble, as you suggest? At times, definitely not. I wasn't aware that I was that far beyond, again, the norm. But I guess over time you really do appreciate that you're not part of the common space, the mainstream. Yeah. It's not to say I can't play in that space.
I know. Yep.
But I think that is probably the part of my personality and part of my general practice that people struggle with the most. And I made reference to it a moment ago when talking about our goat image, which hangs on the wall behind you here as we record. I can step into different spaces equally comfortably. So I can work, even my own business, speaking publicly, I can work in corporate Australia. Not a problem. I can work beyond corporate Australia. I can work in schools. I can work in sporting clubs, art spaces, whatever it may be, and I can do so quite easily, but the thing that I've learned is that I can't afford to change my authenticity in order to work in those spaces. It was only just recently I worked for a big multinational corporate company here in Australia, and a little bit tongue-in-cheek, a little bit pointedly, they said to me when I arrived, "Is this what you're wearing today?" I had just my common apparel on, my jeans, my t-shirts, the way I am, my authentic self in terms of my garments. And I just said in return, well, you've employed me.
Yeah.
So if you've employed me, this is what me wears.
Yeah.
This is what Glenn Manton wears. I appreciate that you're wearing a suit, and if you had have stipulated to wear a suit, I would have worn a suit.
Yeah.
But let's be honest, I'm here to share stories about my life and my person, so I think it's best that I'm dressed as me.
Yeah.
It's quite interesting. Sorry to interrupt. I went back to do the same client a couple of weeks later, and they'd all changed how they dressed.
It's amazing, isn't it? How the shift happens.
Yeah, I found that really interesting. I'm a big believer in advocate for be yourself.
Yeah.
For goodness sake, please be yourself.
And that authenticity, which I'm a huge advocate for authenticity, because I actually think it's a performance state that people that can be authentic and have diversity in how they think and look and feel is actually, whether it's sport or leadership or whatever, is going to bring out the best in that person because they feel safe.
Absolutely.
So, when you feel really authentic and when you feel like you can be yourself, like, what's that feel like for you? Like, if it's at home writing or whatever, that, is there certain tools or triggers that you rely on to sort of unlock that for you?
Another really compelling question. Unfortunately, my answer is not going to serve justice to the question, because my answer is going to be very, very brief. It's a decision that I made when I was 17. I'm now 45. I'm not particularly fond of maths, but we can round that up to 30 years.
Yep.
I made a decision at 17 that I would never act in an unauthentic way again. And I've kept that promise.
Wow.
And that has seen me lose a lot of opportunities.
Yep.
It's seen me fired from a lot of jobs and miss out on various pathways in life that would have been presented had I played the game. It's probably seen me rub people up the wrong way and lose, peripheral friends. I don't think I've lost any good friends as a result of it. But it's been a challenge to myself that I've upheld every day without any problem. So there's nothing, looking back on what I've lost as a result of it, there's nothing there that I really, really cry over or feel at all disappointed about.
Do you think that's because you've been really comfortable to sit in your own space and you can go in? And I'm very similar. I can sit in and I can completely sit out. I don't have any friends from high school or whatever, because I just it hasn't bothered me to have to keep them going if they're not serving a purpose, and that's whether that's right or wrong. Yeah. But is that where it's been easy for you to be really authentic, because you're not feeling the pressure of society's scorecard of the normal success? That you're like, no, my version of success, my version of authenticity and purpose is this, and I'm clear about it, and my steps to do that and deliver that and live that way is this, and that's all that matters at this point.
You talk about a societal scorecard, and I think that's very, very clever language. This podcast is a true insight into my person. Your listeners, yourself, have never spoken to me at length like this before.
Yep.
You couldn't possibly think to score me in any way, shape or form without this type of conversation, without hearing this type of conversation. You can't give me a score.
No.
Because you don't know me.
Yeah.
As my grandmother would say, from a bar of soap.
Yeah.
So this provides some platform to score me from, and I don't mind some sort of evaluation from outside. It's good to have somebody say, hey, that was good, but could be better, or you were right, but only to a certain extent, and throw around ideas and machinations as to how you can improve as a person. I think all of that sort of stuff's really, really valuable. But ultimately, and again, you alluded to this in your question, the only person who has to rest easy with my decisions is me.
Yeah.
And I have made some poor ones, without doubt. But I always put my decisions, my mistakes, my strengths, my weaknesses, my successes against